Good evening, afternoon, morning, everyone, wherever you may be dialing in from. Great to have you here. My name is Kyle Blank. I'm the CEO, Executive Director of Israel Friends. Here today, we have a phenomenal speaker, Charlotte Korchak, who is the Senior Educator and co-founder of JEI, the Jerusalem Education Institute. And we'll get to that in a moment. Just want to, thank everyone, all of our community members and guests for joining us today. Um, 30 seconds on Israel Friends, and part of the reason why the work that Charlotte will speak about and the realities on the ground are so related to our work today. Israel Friends, for those who don't know, was born on 10/7. On October 7th, the organization was founded to protect and save as many Israelis as possible. Over the last 20 months of war, we've been running 24/7 with a very small team. We have a staff of 10 people running a super tight ship, 5% overhead. And our whole goal is to provide our protectors and our citizens what they need to stay safe and alive. And so what that means today is tech innovation, and mental health support. That includes handing drones to soldiers and civilian guards, includes tech innovation like a 3D printing lab in southern Israel, cutting edge work being done to provide the equipment needed. And critically today, our mental health programs that run nationwide, all around Israel through the resilience centers and now the HMOs and other partners, we're providing immediate access to psychiatric care. And this is what Israel Friends is about. In a moment, I'll touch on our emergency campaign, but just for the reality, as everyone knows what the last few weeks were in Israel here with the Iranian events, we had over 1,000 people, new patients, come forwards and request immediate access to psychiatric support. We've already been able to treat that entire population. We treated 800 people over the 12-day window because we run the #1 telehealth platform in the country for immediate access to psychiatric care. So that's our core, that's our bread and butter, that's what we do. Right now, since the events, I'm back home in Tel Aviv. We were forced to evacuate our home because our community, our neighborhood got bombed Sunday night, Monday morning, day 4 or 5 of the events, and a ballistic missile blew up a bunch of buildings about 5 minutes away from our home. And so for those families, as well as families nationwide that have lost everything, Israel Friends is running an emergency campaign for micro grants to provide these families the dignity they deserve, which is food, clothing, and other basic needs, which unfortunately takes time to get. A lot of these families have a lot of needs right now, so we're here to provide them the support that they need. But that's Israel Friends. That's what we're doing. I want to jump into the events of today while you all join to hear from our incredible world-class speaker, Charlotte Korchak. So today we're going to discuss about Iran, its past, present, and its future. And we all know that Israel and Iran, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Tehran have had a long, complicated relationship from flights, 50 years ago to a real true lacking of that, and domestic affairs in Iran having changed so much over the last 20, 50, 100 years. And so today we're going to hear from a foremost expert on the topic. So Charlotte Korchak is joining with us today. She's the senior educator and co-founder of the Jerusalem Education Institute, an incredible, amazing new nonprofit leading in transforming the education space about Israel and the Middle East. Charlotte specializes in Israeli history, effective communication, and how to tackle anti-Semitism. Now, Charlotte grew up in the US and Israel, and when she moved to Israel, it was actually during the Second Intifada. So she's seen these realities firsthand throughout her travels. And she spent the last 15 plus years in this industry educating the world about Israel and its realities as Stand With Us, still rather recently, as their senior educator and international senior educator. That's where Charlotte and I met, actually, just about 15, 20 years ago. I think at the very beginning of your career, Charlotte. I was in New
Yeah.
York, and Charlotte flew in. And what's so amazing to me is that Charlotte's the only person I know who flies more around the world than I do. She flies all over. She's teaching people all around the world. And the last number I heard, not from Charlotte, but from her former partners and boss at Stand With Us, is that she was educating over 50,000 students a year on 5 continents and online, just 24/7, educating high school students, adults, college students, whoever it may be, giving them the resources and knowledge they need. So it is our pleasure and our honor to have you here. and sharing about the work you do at JEI, at the Jerusalem Education Institute, where you're providing the factual, nuanced, and accessible information to all of us here today and to more people around the world. I know you've already been on many flights. I've seen you in Israel and in New York since you started this only in January. So I know you're popping around. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about JEI, and then we'll jump into today.
So thanks so much. And it's so nice to be here with you, Kyle. It's remarkable to see how our relationship has evolved over the last 15 years. And it's really awesome to be friends and colleagues. And I'm so incredibly grateful to Israel Friends for supporting JEI and being our partner as we launch this organization. And again, like you said, the idea is really to just transform the way we educate on Israel for the next generation. I think the last 20 months really demonstrated how much we kind of failed. And I hate to use that term, but how unsuccessful Israel education has been for Jews and non-Jews, and how much there is a lack of understanding of Israel and the Middle East and how Israel fits into the Middle East. And we're seeing it right now with the conversation with Iran. We're seeing it, the lack, even from professionals who are on CNN and on MSNBC, who talk about how Iran is like Iraq, which, if anyone knows any basic understanding of the Middle East, knows that these are two totally different situations, and one really has nothing to do with the other. And yet that was their only basis of comparison, because that's really all they know about the Middle East. And so the idea is to really expand Israel education across the globe to make sure that people truly understand Israel and how Israel fits into the broader Middle East to create a better future. That's the idea in a nutshell. I don't want to take too much time on that. Really want to focus on the topic at hand, but that's the JEI. And like you said, my 15 years of experience with Stand With Us and being an educator in the space all over the world has really helped me kind of understand and have my finger on the pulse of what young people specifically need and want to hear when it comes to how they're being educated on this topic. So that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Incredible. Well, we know both young people and more mature people need this information, as we have a whole spectrum of community members who have joined us today. And we know that a lot of them are sharing this recording with their kids and their grandkids and their friends and their peers at college. We're super excited for that. And we'll talk more about how people get more educated with JEI in the coming months. But let's dive in. So could you provide a brief summary of the longer history of Iran and the Persian Empire? I know that's a lot and we could sit all day, but maybe just a few minutes so we can have a wider context and better color.
Sure. So if we go back and we talk about the Persian Empire as it was called, usually the starting point for that empire goes back to about 550 before the Common Era. Again, right around, obviously, we're talking about ancient history here. And it will last until about 330 before the Common Era. During that time, of course, the person who will establish the empire is Cyrus the Great, which, as Jews, we've heard that name because he had a very significant impact on the Jewish population. But he created this empire. He was a great friend of the Jews. And why we know about him is because when the Jews were exiled by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era, after the destruction of the Second Temple, sorry, I need to slow down. I always need to remember to slow down. I need to remind anyone in the audience that I usually speak to high school students. And if I don't talk really, really fast, they pick up their phones really, really fast. So I'm going to take a deep breath and slow down. But after the destruction of the first temple in 586, Jews were exiled to the area of modern day Iran, Iraq, where the Persian Empire, of course, will emerge. And when he takes over, he's good to the Jews. And that really goes to the philosophy of Cyrus the Great, which I'm going to talk about just because it's such a foundational idea that has persisted in this area. He's famous for the Cyrus cylinder, which some people say was like an early declaration of human rights, right? The idea that we need to have tolerance for different peoples, regardless of their backgrounds. And so essentially, he created an empire that was tolerant of minorities, of other groups, of other religions, other traditions. And essentially, he said, you can practice those things freely, just be loyal to the empire. And that has really persisted throughout the history of the Persian Empire and then into today, modern day Iran. And even to a certain extent under the regime, which is hard to say, but I'll explain a little bit more as we go through this. Um, and what we should also talk about is the religion of that empire, which was, of course, obviously not Islam, given that Islam's not going to emerge until the 7th century. We talk about Zoroastrianism as the predominant religion and will actually remain the predominant religion in that area until the 7th century, when the Islamic conquests make their way into that territory and start to take over. And slowly but surely, Shiite Islam becomes the predominant religion within that area. And so And then there's one, of course, one small thing we might want to talk about, which is just the Purim story, which of course goes back to Cyrus the Great and that around that time period. Now, I will say, Jews, we love the story of Purim. It's an amazing story of, Jews surviving a genocide from this empire. And that also doesn't, again, reflect what the empire really was, which was, again, predominantly tolerant. And it tells this story of this brief period where someone rises up and is against the Jewish people. I will say, as a historian, it's hard for me to talk about this because there's not a lot of verifiable evidence for the Jewish story of Purim. I will say what's fascinating as a historian is that a lot of the way in which the Persian Empire is depicted in the story of Esther, in the book of Esther, is very accurate. How many provinces there were, how kind of the emperor would hold people and host events at his palace. All of kind of those depictions are actually relatively accurate, which tells us that the story was probably written by somebody who was very familiar with the Persian Empire at the time, but possibly that the story of the Jewish survival of the genocide was more a legend rather than actual verifiable history. That being said, when you fast forward to today, and we'll talk more about this, but Esther and Mordecai, the two core figures of this story, there are tombs dedicated to Esther and Mordecai in Iran that are still preserved and are still visited by Jews and non-Jews. So that's just a small, brief story of Jewish persecution, but then really the thriving of Jews within the Persian Empire after that persecution. So again, to fast forward, Zoroastrianism is the main religion, and why it's also important is because Zoroastrianism is about one God. It's about good versus evil. There's a lot of features that actually people say that Zoroastrianism had a strong effect on Abrahamic religions, which is also why, again, you might see connections here between the Jews and the Persians, if you will, given that in terms of their religion, they weren't so ideologically different. And so that also aided in that maintaining that relationship and the lack of division, if you will.
So that paints an amazing set of background of thousands of years to kind of till recent. Let's hone in on, recently the 20th century, the last Shah. What were those policies? How did the people feel about the last Shah? Why did people become upset? What changed that the country ended up being ripe to overthrow him, which seems so long ago, yet there's a conversation today about what's next. But before what's next,
Right.
what happened over the last 50 odd years?
So, well, as a historian, I can't just go back. I have to go back further, right? I can't just go back to the more recent Shah because we have to understand a little bit of that evolution. So, if you go back again, I said Islam takes over in the 7th century. You have these Islamic empires that will control. Jump to the 20th century, and you start to see reforms. You start to see constitution. You start to see more modernization taking place, and that really gets us to the reign of the Pahlavi dynasty, which is the Shah that we talk about. But the Shah that we talk about is actually the son of the original leader of the Pahlavi dynasty. So, just to make sure we know who we're talking about, there's Reza Shah, which was the original who took over in 1925 in the 1920s, and then you have his son Mohammad Reza Shah, who is going to be the one who is toppled in 1979. Just so we can clarify that. So his father in the 1920s starts to implement reforms, modernization, and secularization. And that's a very important point that we need to stress here. Modernization, not that bad, but the secularization really had an impact on the religious ideologues of the country. And that's where we're going to start to see dissent. Now, something to also note about Reza Shah and why he was very beloved by the Jewish community was that in the 1920s, he was actually the first modern Shah to go and visit a synagogue and pray at a synagogue. And it really demonstrated to the people that the Jews were legitimate and were well regarded within Persian society. And so that again continues to push again that the way in which Jews feel towards Iran, which is very positive. They very much felt that they were protected and supported by the Shah and his son. But things that he did to modernize, he established a modern army, he reformed the education and the legal systems. But again, it was a secularization. And that caused pushback. One of the things he did was he started to give equal rights to women. Now, actually, as a woman, I'm not necessarily going to call him equal rights. And here's why. Because one of the things that he did was he basically sent people out to tear the hijabs off of women. Now, as a woman, I would say that's not equal rights. I'm a religious Jew, and at one point, when I get married, hopefully, I will cover my hair. And if, God forbid, somebody came and tried to say they were giving me equal rights by tearing off my hair, my head covering, I would say that's not equal rights. Equal rights means I get to choose whether I want to cover my hair or not. And so it wasn't really equal rights; it was more rights that he was giving to women to not wear the hijab, but it was really, no, you can't wear the hijab. And people see that element of ripping off the hijabs of women really traumatized part of the society and really instilled in Khomeini, the Ayatollah, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who we've all heard of, really instilled in him this drive to topple this this dynasty. So that was the original Shah. And then his son takes over as a young leader, 22 years old during World War II. And he continues this modernization. He's pushed in 1951 to appoint a nationalist leader as the prime minister, and he comes in 1951, and this is Mohammad Mossadegh, who I'm sure some of us have heard of. And one of the main things that this guy wanted to do was take back the oil industry in Iran from the Westerners, specifically from the British. And so he starts to nationalize Iranian oil. Now, obviously, the Americans and the British, the West, are not fans of this. And so, as I'm sure some of us know, in 1953, the CIA and the MI6 allegedly backed a coup to topple Mossadegh, and essentially, the Shah becomes the only leader of Iran, where he doesn't really have a prime minister who's getting in his way or who is disrupting his relationship with the West. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because this starts to really create resentment amongst the Iranian population against Western interference, right? How dare the West come in and topple our prime minister? With all due respect, like, they could be against what we're doing, but they don't have the right to do that. And that becomes also a driving force eventually for the revolution. Now, to fast forward, during this time, also what we saw was, we have to remember that Iran actually borders the Soviet Union, and or not borders, but the Soviet Union was creeping down. And there was influence. There were leftist intellects, Marxist and communist leftist intellects, who were also spreading that kind of again, anti-Western, more communist rhetoric, which of course the Shah had to also suppress. So what we start to see is the Shah, just like his father, trying to modernize and secularize. Well, part of that is the suppression of dissidents. And unfortunately, what we start to see is, while many would describe these individuals as progressive and moving forward, they were also repressive to those who disagreed with them. And so those are pieces that we have to understand again how this revolution is going to come to be. Now, the thing that's really going to push it over the edge is the White Revolution, which in 1963 was a whole host of reforms that were put forward by the Shah, land reforms, which essentially ended feudalism in the country. But imagine if you were one of those feudal lords, a very wealthy landowner, and now your land was taken from you and distributed to, again, redistribute wealth. You're going to be very frustrated with the regime, or with the Shah. So you had land reforms, you had social reforms, improving education and healthcare. But again, what education, right? Education that promoted the Shah, education that wasn't going to be more communist and Marxist. You had voting rights for women. This was a huge social reform that happened that really, really pushed the Ayatollah, because the religious clerics, the religious leaders, the ideologues very much felt that this was not aligned with what they believe, that women shouldn't be in government positions, women shouldn't be able to vote, women have a place in society, and that's not their place in society. And then you have economic reforms, where there was a sale of state-owned factories and profit-sharing schemes for workers, and encouragement of foreign investment, which you would argue was good. But as time goes on, what we start to see as we get into the 1970s is we start to see serious economic issues in the country. And that's actually the main driving force for the revolution. It's not, well, yes, one of the main driving forces, as well as, of course, the repression. If you disagreed with the regime, they had a secret police, the Savak, who would disappear you. And that's not exactly a society that a lot of people like to live in. Again, if you agree with the Shah, you're in good shape. And if you're a woman, you have more rights. rights. And if you're somebody who's more secular, this is good for you. But if you're religious, again, a religious ideologue, if you are somebody who just had their land taken from them, you're not going to be happy with this individual. And so there are positives that came from the white revolution, but there were also a lot of negatives that lead to this growing discontent within the society. And then lastly, more Western alignment during the Cold War, right? The Iranians are going to align themselves more and more with the US, with military and economic aid. And the westernization of the country and widespread corruption among the elites ultimately are going to fuel public anger and a sense of betrayal by the government, which eventually gets us to this revolution. So sorry, I know that was a lot, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage because I think there's kind of a lack of understanding of what led to the revolution. I think people think that it was mostly religious, which actually not really the case. So.
The context is fantastic, already making me rethink some of my thoughts on the matter. And you speak about the modernization, the secularization, healthcare, education, women's rights, and how this all connects, right? Part of it is how people would feel about modernity and being Western, associated. Part of it being about secularization, the religious elements, the land. And the question is then, okay, 1979, the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini, other key influencers who are involved in this coup, and what throws it over, because you've discussed this build up of events, but it could have broken at any point. So what breaks the camel's back? Who is Khomeini, who's clearly such an important figure to understand, and who are his supporters, and what is where the revolution starts? Is that the same place that it necessarily ends?
Right. So actually, it's funny we talk about the revolution of 1979 because January of 79 is going to be the moment that the Shah gets on a plane, goes to Egypt, and leaves Iran, right? And steps down essentially as the leader of Iran. That was January of 79, which means it's funny that we say the revolution of 79, when really I would almost say we should say 78 because there were over a year of ongoing protests in the country. Now, first of all, who were taking part in these protests? So you had course, the traditional religious, and I'll talk about them in a second, just diving a little deeper into who Khomeini really was. But you also had the leftist intellects, who I spoke about previously, who again were suppressed, right? Their voices were suppressed. There wasn't freedom of thought in that respect. University students who also were part of that camp of we want freedom of thought, freedom to learn all of these different ideas. And then you had the influential merchant class who was seriously impacted by the economic reforms of the Shah. So those are the main actors who are taking part in these protests. So we're not seeing it's not just like religious people marching in the streets. It's a huge swath of society that is angry. Now, why then? Well, at this point, you had growing economic issues to the point of significantly high inflation, significantly high unemployment that led people out into the streets. And I mean, where people will rally the most usually is around their wallet, right? When things are going bad, when I can't feed my family, that is when I am going to start to push back, right? And then you also had just more political repression. It got as obviously you had more pushback against the Shah, you had more repression of the Shah, more people being disappeared, more violence in response to these protests, which of course then encourages them more, right? And so that's the why. That's the why then and the who. Now, the real who that we have to talk about though is the Ayatollah, right? The Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, this guy is born in 1900. He becomes a respected Islamic scholar in his early years, becomes a respected Islamic scholar, and then becomes a vocal critic of the Shah, both father and son, to the point that he becomes so influential as a voice against the Shah that he's exiled by the Shah in 1964. And he's actually going to France. And he spends his time in exile in France, which is interesting given again the anti-Western approach. But funny enough, the Westerners are actually going to help the Ayatollah take over once the Shah falls. So the Ayatollah, I mean, again, he's a deep Islamic scholar who believes in very traditional Islam. And so he is very against, obviously, the modernization and the secularization of the country. It's not that complicated when you really think about it. And he, through his teachings, and while he was in exile, through radio broadcast and literally cassette tapes recorded and played in Iran, he's continuing to gain a following. And people in Iran look up to him as somebody who is standing up for traditional Iranian Persian values, specifically, again, the religious. Now, there's a really interesting question here. So, if so many people were involved in the revolution and in the protests, then why is it that the religious are the ones who ended up taking over, right? Because the majority were not the deep religious ideologues. And the answer is because the Shah didn't suppress Islam within the country during his reign. He supported Islamic schools and the teaching of Islam, and he supported the clergy and their ability to still function and be a prominent force within society, as opposed to the other groups who were suppressed, who were pushed aside and really, again, disappeared within society. And so the clergy were really the ones ripe to take over when the Shah eventually steps down in January. So the Shah steps down. 10 days later, the Ayatollah gets on a plane, arrives in Iran to mass celebration, and he starts to implement the what we now know of as the current Iranian regime. But it really wasn't. It wasn't the current Iranian regime. It was, he first said, you know how he took over? I mean, he was saying to people, it wasn't even religious. He was saying, I'm going to make utilities free. You're not going to pay for, you don't have to pay for water. You don't have to pay for gas. We are an oil rich country. He really almost ran as a demagogue to a certain extent, so that not just the religious ideologues would support him, but everyone else would also support him. And then we start to see the slow encroachment of the deep religious ideology. But that also is going to come really with his successor, the current Ayatollah Khamenei, who's going to take over when the Ayatollah dies in the late 1980s. So that's the gist, if you will, of what led to and got us to the 79 revolution and the toppling of the Shah.
Incredibly interesting. Not a topic I was well educated on enough beforehand to understand that so much of this was economic, personal economics. How much of
Yeah.
that actually, not time for today, but how much of that relates to things that happen in our more immediate region in Israel and the greater, lands around it, and how people act in their own personal best interest given extreme situations. So definitely a
And
topic that
sometimes, yeah, I was going to say, and then sometimes get not what they were hoping for, right? You protest and you hope for something. And then, of course, you don't have power. Once a power vacuum is created, that one person's going to take over. And then you don't, unfortunately, that one person protesting doesn't really have a lot of say on what and how things are going to unfold. And that was the tragedy, really, of the Iranian Revolution.
So not intentional, but there's a plug for the PLO and Yasser Arafat and Hamas. So we'll have to do a follow up, Charlotte, in some time where you can explain how so much of the same trends you're discussing happened there in many ways. There's clearly many differences. But jumping back to the Iranian environment, so the Shah falls, and the Ayatollah comes up, and then soon after, there's the Iran-Iraq War, and that
Yeah.
changes so much of what happens in the region, changes
Yeah.
Iran's how it's really engaging with the wider region, how that impacts Israel, and so maybe we could touch on that. What year are we in? Why does it happen? How does that impact Iran's decisions geopolitically?
Sure. So the Iranian War broke out in 1980, and it was really to a certain extent, a territorial dispute, right, over certain areas between Iran and Iraq, that Iran had control over. And I mean, you said it had an impact on the broader region, but really within Iran, we should understand that it really consolidated the power of the regime, right? First of all, war is a great unifying force, and Israelis, I think, know this better than anybody, right? I mean, if you go back to June 12th, right, of this year, and you look at the divisions within Israeli society and what was going on, and then all of a sudden you have this 12-day war where everyone comes together, right? There's no more differences right now. We're all under the exact same rocket fire. And so it's again, war is such a unifying force that it enabled the regime to really consolidate their power and to bring people together and to create really a pride in this Iranian regime that was fighting this war against this enemy, Iraq, right? It allowed hardline figures like Khamenei, again the current Ayatollah, to gain more prominence. And that's really the tragedy too, because he gained more prominence over moderate voices. And so again, when I say consolidating their power, it also turned the regime more and more extreme to a certain extent during this time, given the hardline figures who were able to emerge at this time. War can bring out again extremes. And again, I think as Israelis, we can understand what I mean by that as well, given what we've seen happen in Israel in the last 20 months. And then you also had the IRGC grow into a powerful military force at this time. We can talk more about the IRGC later, maybe when we get to more current. But the IRGC was the International Revolutionary Guard Corps, emerged to really protect the regime. Because remember, you have the Iranian military. The IRGC is not the Iranian military. But if you're the Ayatollah, you want to make sure that if, let's say, the military all of a sudden decides they want to have a coup, you have somebody to protect you. And that's really the IRGC. They're the protection of the regime and the protection of the regime's values. And again, we can talk more about that as we get to today and how the IRGC is used by the regime. And then what also came from the Iran-Iraq War was, of course, the proxy network. And it actually started, well, one could say it really started in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, when Iran really started to throw their support behind the Shiite rebels in southern Lebanon, which of course become Hezbollah. But also in Iraq, they started to fund Shiite groups in Iraq to help them in their fight against Saddam Hussein. I also want to just zoom out for a second. You know, there's something else we have to understand about the 20th century in the Middle East. There was really a battle of ideologies going on here. What we found in the early 20th century was the rise of Arab nationalism, right? Over Islamism, which, and let's not confuse Islamism with radical Islam. That's not the same thing. Islamism is just the ideology that Islam should be the ruling idea of life, right? That in society, Islam is what reigns supreme, and Islam is going to dictate our values and our traditions, right? And so Islamism was the predominant idea in the Middle East. And then comes Arab nationalism of the 20th century, and it starts to rise, right? And reaches its zenith, you could say, with Nasser in Egypt in the late 1950s into the 1960s, when he had unified with Jordan and Syria in the UAR, the United Arab Republic. And I'm telling you all of this because as Arab nationalism started to rise, we started to also see Islamism trying to say, wait a second. And then we started to see things like the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1920s. And as time goes on, what happens is Nasser dies in 1970. And that really is a blow to Arab nationalism, or what eventually becomes known as Pan-Arabism. Now, if you're Persian, first of all, you're not into Arab nationalism, obviously, because you're not Arab, right? But also, if you're an Islamist, you want Islam to be the predominant idea, not Arab nationalism. And so with the fall of Nasser, Arab nationalism took a huge blow, and it really allowed the Islamists to realign and to focus more on how they could then become predominant again in the Middle East. And nationalists were looking for a leader. And one of the people who they kind of designated as the leader could have been Saddam Hussein. And it really was more later in the 1990s when Saddam invaded Kuwait, because that was, again, more Pan-Arabism, the idea of spreading more Pan-Arabism. And so the Iranian War, one of the other impacts was the loss of the Iran-Iraq War by Iran. And really that solidifying the power of Saddam Hussein really pacifies Iran to a certain extent as a conventional military force in the Middle East that has any power, right? And I'm explaining all of that to then understand why you then will default to proxies, to the idea of fighting not conventional warfare, but proxy warfare, right? And so that's why we have then this network that's going to start to grow, where they, planting their seeds amongst the Shiites in Iraq, and they start to support the Shiites in Lebanon, and they start to again fund and arm and train what eventually becomes Hezbollah, that's founded officially in 1985, right? Again, I say that you have to know they were already existing officially in 1985. And then, of course, eventually you have the Houthis in Yemen. That's going to be later on. And I'm saying all of that also to understand that then fast forwarding to 2003, when Saddam is toppled by the Americans, this was a message to Iran. You have an opportunity. We who had kind of pacified us, who had stabilized the Middle East to a certain extent in a horrible way, but there was some stability there. He's gone. And this is when Qasem Soleimani is really pushing forward his development of this Shiite crescent, if you will, in the Middle East, or what some have dubbed the Iranian axis of evil, what they then dubbed the axis of resistance, which I hate to call it. And we see the development even more so of the proxies, which of course gets us to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and of course the alignment also with the Assad regime in Syria. I know that was a lot. Sorry, I'm trying to keep things short, but also trying to contextualize everything at the same time, which isn't easy. So again, the Iran-Iraq War had such a huge impact on where we are now, given, again, the consolidation of the power, the growth of the IRGC and the strengthening of the IRGC, and the strong development of the proxy network that, of course, is going to rear its ugly head in the most dramatic fashion on October 7th.
So you just got in your last sentence of today, I think we'll rewind again to add in, you explained so much of how the region developed, how Iran became radicalized, how and why specifically it became a proxy IRGC element. That's how, right, they're impacting the entire region. Now, we can't leave out that there are other players in this mix enabling Iran, enabling the IRGC, enabling the proxies to grow into where they are. So before we speak about today, before we speak about these proxies, before we speak about 2023 and onwards, there's two other major nations that are involved in this, Russia and China. And maybe you can explain how and why they're involved. What are their interests? Because they're not the same, which impacts how they get involved over time and how they're involved today, or better yet, how they were involved in, let's say, 2023, and how they're involved today, which I think are different.
So I think we're talking about the broader powers, yeah, the support of countries like Russia and China, this broader access that ultimately came to be in the Middle East, yes. And so when we look at that, I mean, first of all, we have to go back. The Iran-Iraq War ends in 1988, and of course, the biggest thing in the 20th century is going to happen just a couple of in the next few years, which is, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's going to lead to a major realignment in the world, right? And after the Cold War, Russia actually becomes the main arms supplier to the Iranians. So that's going to be the first real interaction between Russia and Iran is they become their main arms dealer. And that's kind of the relationship. It's very transactional, these relationships early on. And the main push that drives all of these forces together is, of course, just their rivalry and their tension with the West, right? There's a realignment of West versus East, and the Cold War ends, but a new kind of Cold War emerges with not just the Soviet Union, but now it's Russia, China, North Korea, being the main actors, and of course, Iran eventually becomes part of that axis. And so, and why they are more pushed together as time goes on is because they all also become targets of Western sanctions. And so they also have to work together economically given those sanctions. So we talked about Russia being an arms supplier also during the Syrian civil war. So this is fast forwarding. This is really when the relationship between Russia and Iran is going to deepen. So 2011, 12, 13, we're going to start to see the deepening because, of course, Iran and Russia are working together to maintain the Assad regime. Just a quick note, why? Well, Russia was in Syria, specifically, the Assad regime provided Russia with their only warm water port on the Mediterranean. And so that obviously, from a strategic standpoint, is very important to the Russians, hence their will to want to maintain the Assad regime. And the Iranians, obviously, Syria was part of the proxy network, and they didn't want them to fall. And so that really brought Iran and Russia closer and closer together. Funny enough, since the Ukraine war broke out, right, it became the relationship reversed, where Russia was providing all this weaponry to Iran. And we should know this by now, because we should all know why Iran didn't have aerial defenses once this war broke out on June 13th. And that was because when Israel destroyed their aerial defense system in October, they couldn't rebuild it because those systems came from the Russians. And the Russians obviously don't have any aerial defense systems to spare given their war with Ukraine. So the relationship reversed, where now Iran actually provides Russia with weaponry, with drones and other technology to fight their war against the Russians. So this relationship is deepening both militarily and of course economically. There's a lot of economic relationship between these countries. And then you have China, which the main driving force for China was oil. With sanctions and needing to develop their oil industry, they work very closely with Iran on the oil industry. And during sanctions, the ability to use Chinese currency became very crucial. Again, given the sanctions that were coming down on these countries from the West. So that's kind of how the relationship evolved. It was again very transactional, which is I somebody posted right after we attacked Iran, and somebody posted on Facebook that I saw, and they said, what's going to happen when Russia comes to defend Iran and starts to attack Americans? And I'm just like, that's not going to happen. And he said, why? And I said, because alliances that are built on transactional relationships, you're not coming to the aid of those people. Dictatorial alliances, usually they don't go to bat for each other, especially not militarily. And so this is again purely transactional. And you're not going to see, China sending forces or losing Chinese people for the sake of the Iranians or the Russians or vice versa, right? The only weird thing was North Korea sending forces to Russia, but that's another topic for another time. And so again, very transactional, but mostly it's an alliance against the West. It's the new Cold War. Essentially a realignment that took place in the 1990s, and Iran, given their circumstances and the growth of the regime and what they and their adversarial nature towards the West, this relationship was kind of organic and came together due to those ideas.
Incredibly interesting. We actually, many months ago during the Syrian events, had a phenomenal speaker on that spoke about these relationships and why Syria was able to fall and what Israel's impact on Hezbollah and the Ukrainian impact on Russia. And therefore that left Syria, you know, unprotected from its
Yeah.
supporters, allies, and Axis, which is what
Yeah.
caused Syria to fall,
Yeah.
and what has allowed Israel to create a safety zone for those living in that region. And thinking about that, so we've discussed so much of the region, how it is, but we dive deep in for a second into Iran, right? I know it can feel like we're discussing all the outside, but the inside's important. We discussed a lot of the population of the revolution. We left out something, as most of the participants today here are involved with Israel, and many people on of our community members are Jewish, which is of the people living in Iran over time, historically, Jews and other minorities, right? Um, how are they treated? Why are they treated differently? I think some people have asked, in the Q&A, it already came up, so I'll pop it forwards, is like, why are Jews still in Iran? And are Jews and Israel seen differently? And I know that already popped up in the Q&A, some people were going to ask, so we'll jump to that.
First of all, just a background. Jews in Iran, let's just in the 20th century, if you go back to like 1948, there were about 150,000 Jews still in Iran. And that was one of the larger populations. I mean, in the Middle East, for sure. And we started to see people emigrating well before, by the way, the fall of the Shah. And that was for Zionist reasons, actually. Jews started to emigrate from Iran to Israel for Zionist reasons. But under the Shah, they enjoyed, again, freedom, total freedom of religion. And again, there was modernization, there was secularization, all things that Iranian Jews enjoyed. But even today, right? You have now. This is interesting. I keep trying to look and of the numbers of how many Iranian Jews are left in Iran, and I think the range from somewhere from 8,000 to 20,000. And some people put it right around 15,000, but we probably don't know. And that's probably because, again, how people choose to identify or choose to not identify given the circumstances. But even today in Iran, like you said, why would people want to stay in Iran? So today in Iran, there are dozens of active synagogues. There's kosher butchers, there's mikvahs, Jewish ritual baths, there's a Jewish library, there's a Jewish newspaper. There is religious freedom. Jews practice their religion freely in Iran. Now, there's a caveat here, and I'll get to it in a second. But I would say that the reason why Iranian Jews are still there. So I grew up in Los Angeles, or what some people like to call Tehrangeles. It is one of the largest Persian Iranian populations outside of Iran. It's definitely the largest in the United States. I think it is actually the largest Persian population outside of Iran, both Jews and Muslims, but I was obviously exposed to the Jewish population. I've never heard people talk about their home country the way that Persians talk about Iran. It is the Iranian Jews have been in that country since the fall of the first temple. It has been 2,500 years of history. And I mean, think about how we think about Israel, right? Jews who never stepped foot in Israel, but that's our ancient home. And we have this deep, deep connection with that place, even if we've never been there before. Iranians feel the exact same way about Iran. Iranian Jews feel the exact same way about Iran. Deep ties, deep connection. They love the language. They love the culture. I mean, have you ever heard an Iranian talk about Persian food? They or how they have this amazing card game that they taught me called Folk. And I mean, they're Iranians living in America. They're not American Iranians. They preserve their culture. They love their culture and they love their country. And many of them did not leave because they wanted to. They left because after the fall of the Shah, they felt that they might not be secure. But also, let's also note that it wasn't necessarily anti-Semitism that drove them out. For a lot of people, it was the economic issues. It was just fear of the regime and the repression, things like that, this could get bad. And we have those warnings. So maybe we should get out now, right? But a lot didn't want to leave. And that's why they're still there, especially older Iranians, right? I mean, this is your whole life. You're not just going to pick up and leave, right? And then some young Iranians feel the need to stay because of their family. I mean, I don't know again if you know Persians, but the family ties, I mean, they run deep, right? And so you're not just going to abandon your parents, right? And move away. And some people felt like they had to do that, but a lot didn't want to. So there are still Jews in Iran. Now, I said that they enjoy religious freedom. And then the other question was, how do they separate Iran from Israel, right? Like, or Jews from Israel, excuse me. So we're good with the Jews, but we hate Israel. This is actually a very simple answer. Khomeini, the Ayatollah, who took over in 79, actually issued a fatwa in 79, a religious edict that declaring the protection of the Iranian Jewish community. He forbade attacks against the Iranian Jews, and he drew a clear distinction between them and what he called godless, blood sucking Zionists. And so it's not hard if I'm a religious Iranian, right, who is deeply supportive of the regime. I'm going to look to the leader that I looked up to, right, who was the one who initiated this regime, and I'm going to look to his fatwa and I'm going to say he ordered me to not attack that community. So I'm not going to attack that community. Now, let's jump to the other problem though. Sharia law is the law of Iran. Now, Sharia law doesn't necessarily just discriminate against Jews, it discriminates against all non Muslims, right? And so that is where we see discrimination against Jews. They can practice religion freely. But when it comes to now their civil rights, their political rights, that's where things get bad, right? So there's limitations. They can't hold senior government positions. They can't serve as military commanders. They can't work as judges. They can't. Their testimony in court doesn't hold as much weight as the testimony of a Muslim. And that's again not just for Jews, but for all non-Muslims, right? So you see natural discrimination built into the Sharia law system that then non-Muslims in Iran suffer. Um, there's 1% of the Iranian population that belong to what they're called recognized non-Muslim religious they're recognized non-Muslim religious minorities. And there's citizens again because of Sharia law. And then you also have the non-recognized religious minorities, which they have no constitutional rights whatsoever. Okay. And where does that come from? The idea of the protected dhimmi status, right, within Islam, where if you're a person of the book, if you're a Christian, you're a Jew, you're protected within Islam, right? But if you're not one, if you're Baha'i, if you're of another tradition, there's no protection for you whatsoever, right? So minorities face discrimination and violence, religious persecution. The Baha'i Sunni Muslims face religious persecution, and even some Christians, which shouldn't be the case. But again, that edict didn't come down for the Christians. And you have they face discrimination in so many areas like education, employment, people, small ethnic groups who are trying to preserve their culture are very restricted in that because again, the law of the land is Islam and they want to create this unifying force and we're one Iran and there's no place for these ethnic minorities. So that's kind of the background on Jews and non-Jews, who are minorities within the Iranian regime and how they're treated. So religious freedom, but no, but not a lot of political and civil rights that are protected by the regime.
So I think that segues perfectly, both internally, domestically, and externally, to the IRGC. And the reason is that you spoke about how people at the beginning, fled Iran after the revolution because they were afraid of what the regime might be. And from that fear comes the reality of the IRGC, what we know, how it impacts both the Jews and non-Jews who have all different levels of rights as you just described, as well as the Muslim population that lives, domestically, and then how the IRGC impacts the entire Middle East. And so, and that's a lot to unravel, but I think it's critical that we better understand the IRGC before we touch on what do we think is going to happen forwards after recent events.
Because I know we have a hard stop at the hour mark. So let's do this quickly. The IRGC is, again, they act as a military. When it comes to the broader Middle East, we know their influence comes from the Al Quds Force, which is really their foreign operations, right? Inside of the country, the IRGC was acting as a militia, then more as a military. And then as time goes on, when you get to the time period of Ahmadinejad, about 15 years ago, we start to see the IRGC get more into also politics, and they're put into key government positions, right? And then they also get more intelligence capabilities, internal surveillance, monitoring of dissidents, maintaining a network of informants who can then inform on individuals that will then be arrested and taken by the regime. And so the IRGC grows significantly in terms of their strength around again 15 years ago, when they get more and more involved in the political space as well as, and not just being this military force. And under Qasem Soleimani, they grow as a military force as well, both inside and then outside. Now they also have different branches. So you've got the domestic security wing of the IRGC, which is known as the Basij, which they're instrumental in suppressing protests violently, right? So the ones that you see those videos of them going out and beating women, that's the Basij, right? Who go out and really violently enforce the laws of the regime amongst the population within Iran. And they enforce the social code of the clerics, and they do it again through severe violence that instills intense fear in the population that gets them to stay quiet. And then you also have a specialized unit for control, what are known as the Sarala, which is the IRGC command focuses specifically on protecting the regime from domestic threats. So they coordinate operations with the Basij and the intelligence forces and police to suppress protests and they also do cyber operations and identify and arrest activists and journalists. So the IRGC has, I mean, when people say, like, why is it so hard to overthrow them? Like, why can't somebody rise up? What about the Iranian military? It, the IRGC has so much power and has spent so many years arresting and suppressing and killing dissidents. And they do it through ideological commitment. People who are part of the IRGC are indoctrinated into this. And it's the exact same thing we see with Hamas and any other organization like it, where they are diehard, right? So that's number one. There's direct loyalty to the supreme leader that's taught. And again, you're indoctrinated into that. And then they're entrenched politically and economically into the country. And so that also makes it even harder to topple them. And then with the asymmetric warfare that's being fought with the proxies, it deepens the feeling amongst Iranians that they have immense power, which is key to what we're going to just talk about when we have such a short time, but of what's happening right now, and how what just happened will influence the way that Iranians see the IRGC and see the regime, given how weak to almost non-existent some of these Iranian proxies have become.
So let's jump to that, right? The understanding how strong the IRGC is and how crazy of a police state it is, and how influential they are in impacting the growth of Hezbollah in Lebanon and elsewhere. But jump to today, right? So we all know what happened over the last 20 months. We all know what happened on October 7th, know how involved Iran is in all of these events. the last 20 months have seen many parts of this axis crumble. Let's jump
Yeah.
to June, July 2025. So much of this axis has fallen apart. Is there an understanding of how many people in Iran of 90 million people support the regime in the IRGC? Is there an understanding of where it's going?
Yeah. So, I mean, the what happened since October 7th is monumental, right? I mean, I would say really took a turn in September of last year with the pager attack against Hezbollah and then the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. But even more so, go back to August, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, right? And then you have the Syrian regime fall, right? The Assad regime fall. The Iraqi militias, they go quiet, right? And the only people who are still really active are the Houthis, but barely, right? The Houthis fire one ballistic missile just as a symbolic sign, right? It's not like one ballistic missile is going to get through Israel's aerial defenses. You'd have to fire a barrage, as we saw with Iran, right? And so you have the crumbling of the axis, which is sending a message to Iranians. Maybe the regime is not as strong as they were projecting, right? Or maybe they were, but they're not anymore, right? And that really came to a head when Israel attacked. June 13th, Israel attacks, and Hezbollah, via email, by the way, sends out a message saying, We're not, we're not getting involved. Hezbollah was created by Iran to be their insurance policy, to be the one that comes to their aid. And when Israel was to attack, and Hezbollah says, we're not taking part. That is a huge message to the people of Iran. The access is falling. Okay. Now, look, people can't speak freely, but from what we understand, the regime has less than 20% support. Okay. Especially amongst the youth, which of course we saw took part in the protests. They were the main people taking part in the protest and continue to be people who take very defiant acts against the regime, right? Women who will break out in song on the subway system or will walk defiantly without their hijabs at risk of death, as we all know, reminding ourselves of Masa Amini, right? The figure of the women's revolution that they attempted a couple of years ago. And so the regime is weak. Now, that being said, the war ended with a ceasefire. And the tragedy of that to a certain extent is we weren't all the way there. And what it enabled was the Ayatollah, still from a bunker, which is ridiculous that you think that this guy has power, but he's filming a recording to you from a bunker. But him being able to say, see, I was right all along. Ultimately, the religion protected us, and here we still are, and we survived. And he's using this victory that he's calling it, right? Because we're still, and they stopped their fighting against us to even further promote his religious ideology. And so those who support him even more deeply support him. Those who don't are not about to turn, but the majority. But given everything we said, toppling this regime is not an easy thing to do. Even if you had enough popular support to do it, and even if the same thing happened, a year of endless protests against the regime happened, the question is who would take over. And in my last minute, here's the ideas. They're very slim. Of course they are. The IRGC and the regime had spent 25, 30 years suppressing all dissent within the country, right? Killing or arresting, imprisoning, and many who would have dissented, which by the way, 99% of Iranians who live outside of Iran are against the regime, obviously, right? And that's the point, right? So much of the dissent also left, right? And so who would take over? You have the son of the Shah possibility, but he's lived outside of Iran since he was 17 years old. Iranians would say, you don't know Iran. You don't know what we've lived through. You don't know what we're dealing with, right? Who are you to come now back from exile and try to take over? The Ayatollah did it, but people might say he could be somebody who could come in as an interim, right, to try to hold things down and reform to then be able to maybe get to a parliamentary democracy, which is what, according to polls, a majority of Iranians would like to see their government become. But there isn't really strong opposition within the country. And even when people say if the regime was toppled, who would take over? The people that they're listing are people who were still part of the regime. People like Hassan Rouhani, who was the former president, or Javad Zarif, who was the former foreign minister. And people say, well, they could maybe come together. They were definitely more moderate than the regime, but they maybe could come together and start to build something. But the hardest part about this is I think all of us would have loved to see something that hinted that the regime would fall, given the immense weakness that they are projecting. But given the circumstances of what they've done in the country, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to be toppled and for a government to emerge that is one that we might want to see and one that Iranians might want to see. So there's a lot to look not forward to, but to there's a lot to continue to watch as we see this evolve. But right now, it looks like the regime could hold their ground, and that's I think a tragedy for many. So.
Well, Charlotte Korchak, thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone who joined. A reminder that Charlotte is doing speaking engagements about this and all topics related to Israel and the Middle East, running a webinar series and education series starting, I think, only in 2 weeks, which we'll be sharing information about in the coming days, as we'll be sharing information about those micro grants that we're providing to Israelis whose homes were hit by Iranian ballistic missiles. We've learned the history today. We've discussed what might be the future of Iran. What's important to note is the history and reality and future of those Israelis who have been harmed in these events. And that is a deep, deep area which so many of us, all of us care about. And we'll be sending out information about that where all of you can be involved in directly supporting families who have lost their homes and all of their belongings. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be following up by email. Our team is always, always available. Charlotte, to you and your entire team, thank you so, so much. And we look forward to in a few months having you back on and hearing what's the update post the ceasefire kind of settling in and other events
Yeah.
that may occur. So thank you for your time today, and we will see you again in the near future. Everyone have a safe, safe day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Israel friends. Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everyone.